So I decided, and this is the motivation, to try to take a deeper dive into the questions about what the philosophical tradition offers us in thinking about how to live. In fact, it is a way of addressing a challenge, a question that was first put in the clearest and most articulate way by no less a person than Socrates, because Socrates in his day challenged his fellow Athenians to try to answer the question, what sort of person should I be? How should I live? What matters in life enough that it should shape how I live and help me to choose the goals towards which I act? And he found, when he asked his fellow Athenians these questions, what matters, how should we live, how should you live, that they hadn't really thought about it very deeply at all. He discovered then what many, many centuries later Bertrand Russell wonderfully encapsulated by saying, most people would rather die than think, and most people do. And this, of course, is the great tragedy of humankind. And it was a tragedy that Socrates and many after him have sought to help people avoid by getting them to think, by getting them to answer that question. And there is something in all the simplicity of Socrates' own view about this matter, which, seeming very, very simple, is nevertheless very profound and very subversive. Because the one thing that we know Socrates said, and you will be aware, of course, that in fact, the Socrates who appears in Plato's dialogues is a mouthpiece for Plato. Even indeed in some of the later dialogues of Plato's, Socrates is not even a mouthpiece really. He even gets the worst of the argument in the Parmenides, for example. But in the early dialogues of Plato, we do hear the authentic voice of Socrates, and therefore we know this one thing about what he did say. What he did say was that the life truly worth living is the considered life, the life chosen, the life thought about. In fact, he put the point negatively. He said the unconsidered life is not worth living. Because if you haven't thought about your life, your values, your goals, then you're living somebody else's idea of what a worthwhile life is. You're a football in somebody else's game. The direction you travel in has been chosen by other people. And what he wanted to get people to do was to reflect on that fact, to ask themselves, why do I live as I do? Why do the things that I think matter, the things that I think are important, why do I think them? Because you see, even if you consider the life you're living now and the kinds of choices you make and have made, even if you came to the conclusion that they were right, that that was the right way to go, that you're satisfied with your life, at least the process of thinking about it and reviewing it would have made it your own. You would have come into possession of the values that guide you, because you would have applied to it the thing that is most valuable to us, and that is our possession of reason and our power of choice. So that's what Socrates wanted people to do. He wanted them to think, he wanted them to choose, he wanted them to live the considered life. And there was a particular reason why Socrates was concerned about these things in his day, and that is that he lived at a time which the philosopher Karl Jaspers described as the axial age. Axiology is the study of values, both ethical, moral, and aesthetic values. And by the way, I should just pause there for one moment, because you notice I've used that pair of words, ethical and moral. They don't mean the same thing. You can tell that they don't by looking at the etymology of the terms. Ethics comes from an ancient Greek word, ethos, which means character. And therefore, the ethical question is, how should I live? What sort of person should I be? The word morals comes from a coining by Cicero. Cicero was a very skilled and very perceptive, insightful interpreter of some of the Greek philosophers into the Latin conversation. And therefore, in his Tusculan Disputations and his book on old age and his book on moral duties, had to find coinings in Latin for aspects of what the Greeks had talked about. And he was particularly interested, as many of the great Republican Romans were in the question of our duties and obligations, our service to society, our relationships to others. That is to say, a much narrower range of concerns than the concerns of ethics. And he coined a term. He took the word mos, morus, that's M-O-S, mos, morus, plural mores, which we still use in English to denote custom, etiquette. And he applied this term, moralia, to denote how we behave. And our behavior, of course, is predicated on questions about our relationships to others. So morality is about those obligations, about relationships, and it's as I say, a narrower range of concerns than the much larger concern about how we live our life. To appreciate the difference, consider this, that it is an ethical matter what colour you paint the front door of your house. It's not a moral matter, unless it is such a hideous colour that all your neighbours are upset by it and you ignore them. Then it becomes a moral matter. But the ethical matter is about your ethos, about what you are, how you live. Your morals are about how you behave. And it was the ethical that Socrates was concerned with, because the axial age, the age of first reflection on values, was the age where, in all the great civilizations known to us at the time, people had begun to think about the questions of individual life and of social life. Prior to that time, the concentration on those matters was much less, or at any rate we know very much less about what people thought, other than the fact that prior to the axial age, what seemed to be the norm was that the idea of virtue was very much the idea of warrior virtues, of the virtues of courage and fortitude, of the preparedness to fight in defense of your tribe or your city. And that was something that remains captured, in fact, in the very language that we use. If you look at the word virtue, the first syllable of that word is the word vir, V-I-R, which in Latin, of course, means man in the masculine sense. So virtue started as a masculine thing of courage and fortitude and the rest. But in the axial age, people became aware of the fact that we had to think differently about relationships and about communal living, about the nature of society, and about how society might make room in it for good individual lives. In fact, I like to tell the story, and so I tell it at every opportunity, about a moment captured in one of Aeschylus's plays, where this is dramatized, this shift from thinking about the old way of virtue to the new civic virtues, from the warrior to the civic conception of how the good life might work out. And the play in question is the Eumenides, which is the third of the Oresteia trilogy. And you were all reading it in bed last night, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you may remember that the Oresteia trilogy, of course, is premised on the return of Agamemnon from the Trojan War. This is a really, really wonderful, perhaps the greatest soap opera in all literature, because the whole story is about how, because of the theft of Helen away to Troy, had precipitated the 10 years of war. Agamemnon, as the chief king of Greece, of all the Greek kings, had to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia to make it possible for the great fleet to sail to Troy. The fleet of 1,000 ships. So I remind people that when we say of Helen that she had a face that launched 1,000 ships, it gives us a metric for aesthetics. A milli Helen is just enough beauty to launch one ship, so now you can use that as a calibration. But when he got home, having sacrificed his daughter and been away for 10 years and what have you, his wife Clytemnestra, who had taken a lover in his absence, Aegisthus, and anyway was cross with him, murdered him in his bath on the day that he returned. And therefore their son Orestes, about whom the trilogy is written, had to take revenge. Under the dictates of the warrior virtue code, he had to revenge his father's murder, and since his mother had murdered his father, he had to kill her. So he did. And then he was in big trouble, because there were these deities, the Furies, whose job it was to punish anybody who had committed such a crime. Their task was to torment, drive mad, ultimately destroy anyone guilty of such a horrendous thing. So they pursued Orestes. He managed to get himself to Delphi, where the god Apollo lived. He explained his problem, my dad, my mum, so big trouble. So he said, well, get yourself to Athens, to my sister Athena. She's very, very smart, and she'll work out something for you. And I, Apollo, will put the Furies to sleep just long enough for you to do that. He managed to get to Athens. He managed to explain his problem to Athena, and she said, I know what we'll do. We will summon a jury of citizens of Athens to consider your case. So they did. And Orestes had Apollo as his defense attorney. That's handy, have a god as your defense lawyer. And he gave the argument to the jury that Orestes was not guilty of killing a parent because a mother is not a parent, she's just a receptacle. Half the jury accepted this argument, and so Athena used her casting vote to set Orestes free. Just as she did so, the Furies arrived in Athens, and as was their wont, they were furious. They said to Athena, what? You've just got a lot of people together, jaw, and you've set him free? It was our duty to punish him for what he's done. But you, talk, and there he is. We've let him off. Now, Aeschylus captures this dramatic moment when the hinges of history change by having the Furies say to Athena, you young gods, notice that, the new gods, you young gods have usurped our role, because it was our part to punish such a terrible crime, and you've done this, a jury, a court case. And Athena said, yes, because we live in a new world, and we must think differently about how we do things, how we're going to achieve justice, not by means of the old eye for an eye stuff, but by thinking things through and coming to an agreement premised on negotiation about how we should live. Now, Socrates was born 10 years after Confucius died, and either 10 years after the birth or the death of the Buddha. We don't know the Buddha's dates very well, but he was, as you see, a very near contemporary of them. And they, in their own societies, were reflecting on very similar matters, thinking also about a new world, a new dispensation of thinking. And Socrates was a very significant figure. This is why we remember him, because of what he attempted to do. Indeed, to the irritation eventually of his fellow citizens, because they put him to death. He was such a gadfly. But his task was to make people think. It just shows you that making people think can be dangerous, because they get very irritated. They don't want to think, and they certainly don't want to have their normal conceptions upset too much. But Socrates did it, and he left us with this great and very, very profound challenge to think about how we live and what we're to do. Well, the reason why Socrates' challenge is subversive is because practically everybody who's ever lived on this planet, every human being, in any society, at any period of history, has been told that there is an answer, there is a way to live, there is something you must believe and do in order to be safe, in order to get into heaven, in order to do the right thing. A one-size-fits-all answer to the question of what we should be, how we should think, and how we should behave. But Socrates' challenge to each individual that he met was that each individual has to think for himself or herself what to be, how to live, and how to behave. And that requires accepting a really rather significant point, and that is that we have to have some degree of self-understanding in order to see what our capacities are, what our talents and bents are, and what we're interested in, what we think we might be able to do. And then we have to take that material and we have to see how we can apply it so that we live in a way which is genuinely worthwhile, living a life which is genuinely good to live. Now you notice that this is a highly individualistic kind of challenge. Each individual having this responsibility, each individual having to think about their own unique way forward. But one of the things that we do when we begin to reflect on the question of what we are and how we should live is we recognize that even though we are individuals, we are also members of a social species. We are social creatures. We need others. We need to love and be loved, to have friends, to be part of a community, to feel that we have a place in that community, that we are valued, that we can contribute something. And this duality, our individuality and our sociality, therefore, form the matrix within which we need to think about the construction of good and worthwhile lives. Well, Socrates, having got people thinking about this, generated in people like Epicurus, like Zeno of Citium, who was the founder of the Stoic movement, in the Cynics, of whom the most famous, of course, was Diogenes, you may remember, the chap who lived in a barrel. In all these different ways of thinking about how to answer that question and how to live, generated the set of ethical schools that followed Socrates' time. Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Cynics, the Cyrenaics, they, all of them in their different way, proposed answers to the Socratic challenge. I'll say something about each of them briefly in a moment. But first, I should just mention that the idea underlying Socrates' view that we have a duty to ourselves as well as to others to really reflect on these questions, to really accept the challenge, to think about how we're to live, is something which you may, on the face of it, think, well, isn't this something that people setting out in life, perhaps in early adulthood, perhaps when they have the whole of life before them, can do? What about those of us whose 21st birthday parties are now somewhat fading memory? You know, there's that Russian proverb which says we are all born in an open field, but we die in a forest. And there are different interpretations of that, one of which is that when we are born, all things are open and possible to us. But at the end of life, we are closeted around by the thickets and shadows of a forest in which all the choices we've made have determined us to one single place, in the darkness thereof. And this seems rather a dismal kind of thought. But actually, to counter that thought, one need only remember what Epictetus said. Now, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus a slave, Marcus Aurelius an emperor, were the two, along with Seneca, were two of the great Stoic thinkers of the later period, of later antiquity, in the Roman imperial period. And Epictetus used to say to his pupils every day when they'd had their discourses and they'd had their discussions, and they were leaving, he would say to them, "Tell me, how long will you delay to be wise? How long will you delay before you really think about this challenge and come up with some views about how you might live and what you might be?" And then, of course, there would be, among those who attended his discourses, folks whose 21st birthdays were a bit of a faded memory, who were a bit superannuated. They would say, well, I mean, what's the point now? And he would say, no, even in the last hour of a very, very long life, you could become wise. Even in the very last hour of a long life, you could make that choice. And indeed, in reflecting on what you really do value and what you really want to be, even in the moment that you begin doing that, as Aristotle long before Epictetus said, the minute that you begin this process of reflection, you are already living the worthwhile life, because the worthwhile life is one which is going to be characterized by thought. But in that last hour of a long life, what you choose, how you see yourself, what you think of yourself, will make a difference to how you've lived right up to that point. Even though every human life is full of its mistakes and its sorrows and its tragedies, its suffering, it's all too brief and few moments of joy. Nevertheless, reflecting on it, we can see the pattern, and we can see what might count as the good that there has been in it. And that would be some feature of the wisdom that one achieves, even in that last hour. So this business of accepting the Socratic challenge to think about life is something which applies to all of us at any point in life. Now, a a very, very important point is this. If you think about it, when we get dressed to go out to a party or into the world, we all like to have a little bit of something which is individual, little nice coloured scarf, or something which will make us express our individuality a little bit, but only a little bit, because most people don't want to stand out too much. Oscar Wilde, that great philosopher, said, most people are other people. That is, most people take their opinions and the way they behave and their values from other people. We're all rather anxious not to stand out too much and in the wrong way. So we cleave to the conventions. We cleave to the norms. We accept what parents and schools and society tell us about what we should do and how we should behave. I mean, here's the trajectory. Go to school, get an education, get a job, get a mortgage, have a family, get a pension, die. Okay, that's the general trajectory. And if you sort of do that, and you don't, really go off piste too far, then people will say, well, he had a good life, or she had a good life, did the right thing, conformed. The Socratic challenge is, if you are living that life, if you think, yes, I want an education, I want a job, now that's a very a defensible thing to want. After all, we need resources for our lives, look after people we care about, be able to do some of the things we'd like to do, our holidays in the sun and so on. These are all valuable things. And they should never be knocked. The conventions are conventions because they have something good in them, because they do provide a way of being and doing and conforming and consorting with others. So I'm not knocking it. But we nevertheless still have that Socratic challenge, even in the course of normativity, of the normal way of life, where we ask ourselves that question, am I doing what I'm doing just because it's said to be the right thing to do? Or am I doing it because I see the value in it? Am I doing it because I want to do it? Like I said right at the outset, you may reflect on your life, and you may think, well, the way I am and what I do and how I live is okay. I'm okay with it. I can see the point in it. That process of having reviewed it and accepted it would be a way of answering Socrates' challenge to us, because it would make one's life one's own. It would make our lives something that we give consideration to. But of course, it could also happen that one might think about one's life and say, what the hell am I doing? This is not how I really want to live, or how a person should really live. I'm going to take the advice of the second apparition in Macbeth, which you remember was, be bloody, bold and resolute, and do something different. Throw it all up, throw all the cards up in the air, make a different choice, go somewhere else, be something else. Now that's a possibility, and it would be an assertion of our freedom. And that immediately, of course, raises questions. I can see that among some of you, the very word freedom will bring to mind the question whether we really are able to choose. Do we have free will? When we think about these things and we think about the choices and ways of life, we sometimes express the point by using that pronoun that I've been using all evening so far, the pronoun we. Well, who are we? Who am I? I'm not an unemployed black lesbian woman who's a refugee in some country where the language is not my native language. The experience of such a person is utterly different from my experience. So does we embrace both that person and myself? When the philosophers say we should do this and we should do that, do they really mean absolutely everybody and in all the circumstances of life? Do they mean those of us who live in a beautiful town in England, Bath, with a job or a pension, reasonably safe, food to eat every day, clean water to drink? Or do they mean people who live in places of strife and struggle, where it's hard even to get a drink, where there's danger, where life is harsh? Well, these are important questions. the question about who we are, and the question about whether we're free enough to change, free enough to think about our values and then to do something different, maybe to make that big wrench of a change to live according to values that we recognize as much more valuable values than the ones we think we're living by. Are these things possible? Well, yes, they are. This is the extraordinary thing about us in our individuality. Firstly, we have to accept that the possibility of change exists. The possibility that we could do things differently from the way we've been channeled so far. That has to be a possibility, because if we thought of ourselves, as we're now told by the neurologists we should, as kind of automata, that all our actions are determined by what happened billions of years ago in the history of the universe, then of course the entire conception we have of ourselves as thinkers, as choosers, as feelers, as moral beings, and most importantly as ethical beings, would just be a massive error, just a huge mistake about ourselves. And that is not possible, that we could really change and do things differently. And that way of thinking, of course, is an impossibility. You can't think in those terms. We have to think. It's an undischargeable assumption of our lives that we are free. Now, of course, the freedom in question is a metaphysical freedom, not a social freedom. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, rip off all your clothes and run down to the Christmas market now screaming. That's something that you could do, but you're extremely unlikely to do it because, of course, we are like flies caught in the spider web of law and expectations and society and normal behavior. So in that sense, we're not free. We're constrained. We're constrained by our obligations, our commitments, our promises. The fact that we have to pay tax and drive on the left-hand side of the road. These are things that constrain us all the time. And yet within that, metaphysically, within ourselves, we are free. And each one of us, even though we live in a society among others, and we have to yield up to others some degree of our personal liberty so that we can get along with them and they can have some degree of personal liberty too. Nevertheless, within ourselves, in the great universe of our minds, we are sovereign. I don't know whether you know that poem, "My mind to me a kingdom is, such perfect joy therein I find, as far exceeds all earthly bliss, that God or nature hath assigned." You really are free in your thoughts. You really are free to live in the world of the mind, those choices that really characterize you and really express who you are. And then those choices in the world of the mind will feed into the world of physical reality and make a difference to how you act there and how you relate to others there too. So it is not impossible to be free, nor is it impossible to personalize the we, when we talk about we, to the I, to who I am, to which something responds in each one of us individually to that first person pronoun. And that is the thing, the I, the first person, which is responsible, which is free, which can make those choices, and which therefore needs to reflect on the Socratic challenge. Who is that I? What can it do and what can it be so that the life it lives can be something that it owns and which is good? Good to live. The good life, not in the sense of the pious life or of the party life, but the life that feels good to live because it has in it the direction and the satisfactions that make it feel that it is worth living. Now, in the book on which I'm basing this talk, Philosophy and Life, I address the questions, the great questions that people do want to have answered. The question of the virtues. I mean, the reason why the philosophers over time have talked about the virtues of courage and wisdom and prudence are good reasons, and we ought to reflect on those things. What is prudent? What does make us wise? And of course, the great question of happiness, the great question of love, the great question of death. These are all things that we need to consider because they lie front and center and deep in the progress of living. We say, for example, don't we, that about our children anyway, we say of them, well, all I want is them to be happy. We say, what are you looking for in life? Well, I want to be happy. Funny enough, in our modern use of the term happy, the word happy, we now mean something like an emotional state, a sort of contented, smiley, smiley kind of state. That was not what happiness meant for most of history. To be happy meant to be in a good situation of life. Have a roof over your head, food to eat, warm in the cold. You might have a toothache and just quarrel with your spouse, but even so you were happy if you had those other things. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, said the American Declaration of Independence, and it didn't mean life, liberty, and smiley, smiley. It meant life, liberty, and a good condition of life. And this is what was meant. You may remember this is a story, again, that I love to tell, because it really does capture something very, very central to all this great debate about the ethical, about the Socratic challenge. And that is the story, you may remember, of Solon and Croesus. Solon was one of the 7 sages of Greece, asked by his contemporaries to give Athens a new set of laws, after which he went on a long, long journey so that the laws would have time to settle down. He wouldn't be pestered by his fellow citizens to change them. And on his long journey, one of the places he visited was the court of King Croesus of Lydia. Lydia is where Anatolia is now, in Turkey. And King Croesus was rich. You know the phrase we have, as rich as Croesus? He was by far the richest individual of ancient times. Very proud of it. And he used to have his visitors shown the great panoply of wealth in his treasury. And then when they came to have dinner with him afterwards, he would say, who, in your opinion, is the happiest man in the world? And Solon said, well, I know some people back in Athens. And Croesus was very cross. What, you choose a commoner over me? I'm a king and I'm so rich. Solon said, I don't know whether you're happy, but I do know you should think about what would make you so. And the reason why is the brevity of life. But human life is less than 1,000 months long, on average. Do the maths. Suppose you live to 80. What's 12 times 80? 960 months. And unless you party a lot, you're asleep for a third of them. Another third, you're in a queue in Waitrose, if you're lucky, or Tesco, or somewhere like that. So you think, oh God, I've got about a third of 960 months, 300 odd months, really to live with all the passion and vividness of a human life? It's a very depressing thought. Until I point out 2 things to you. The minor thing is that 300 odd months is about 25 years, so that's not so bad. But the really good news is, and this comes ex cathedra from a professor of philosophy, there's no such thing as time. That's the good news. There's only experience, and it's easy to prove this. Go to Paris for the weekend with somebody you really like, and you're there forever. When you get back on Monday, it's gone in a flash. This shows you that time is elastic around experience. A better way to prove it is to point out that if you did exactly the same thing at every moment of every day, got up at the same hour, got up at the same breakfast, read the same words on the same page, every single day of your life, how many days would you live? 1. So there is no such thing as time, there's only experience, and therefore the more richly you experience, the more lifetimes you live. Not 960 months, but 960 lifetimes. And this is why it matters. This is why Solon wanted to get Croesus to think about this, that how we choose how to live, how we choose what to be, is going to make a huge difference to how many lifetimes we live, to how much experience we have, and how richly we experience it. And that's why it really matters. And that's why that story, the story of Solon and Croesus, is very central to thinking about how we're to answer the Socratic question. Now, somebody who'd read my book said to me, I see, he said, that you're much, much more in favor of death than you are of love. Well, no, not quite, but I could see why he thought that. Well, but the reason is that I think when one has the correct attitude to death, one sees its value for living life well. One sees the prospect of it, the inevitability of it, as a kind of picture frame around the portrait that we paint by our actions and choices of our lives. We never experience death other than as grief for the loss of people we care about. Death happens to other people. Death in our own lives is the experience of grief. Of course, dying is an act of living. You're alive while you die, and that could be pleasant or not, but that's a different matter. You're not going to ever experience being dead. So death is what happens to others. But the fact of it is what gives shape and content to our lives as we live. And on this point, Seneca says something wonderful in his beautiful essay, which is really framed as a letter to Lucilius, one of his letters, Stoic letters. He says, every day, even, again, at the very end of a long life, every day has in it the potential of all days. Every day has the whole of life in it. And every day that we are alive, we live. And therefore, it's as if, again, to repeat this Sironic point, it's as if we live forever in our living. And that is why the living should be good. It should feel good to live. That is why we've got to make those choices and answer the Socratic challenge. Think about what makes our own individual lives, and therefore, given the social character of ourselves, our relationships to others, good. The case of love, well, especially since the 18th century, but of course there's always been the tradition, medieval, courtly tradition, and one or two indications of it earlier. But since the 18th century, really, when people mention the word love, they immediately think of romantic sexual love. And this is a result of all the novels of, from Richardson onwards and all through the 19th century, and now Hollywood. Every song and poem seems to be about falling in love. Now in the movies, what happens is when two people realize that they're attracted to one another, they immediately begin to rip off all their clothes and, have sex on the kitchen table and so on. I don't know if that happens in reality. I've never noticed it. I've been wondering. But, this conception of what love is very much a tiny fraction of the experience of love that people have in their lives. The love we have for our children and our parents, our friends, our colleagues, our comrades. The love that we have for people we don't know but care about in their situations around the world. All these different kinds of love were recognized by the Greeks. They had different names for them. Storge, pragma, agape, ludos, lots of different names for different kinds of love. And they thought that eros, erotic love, the kind that now seems to occupy the whole horizon of thinking about love, they regarded as an infliction from the gods, a kind of punishment, a sort of madness. When we think about love, therefore, we have to think beyond all the fury of infatuation and think how to love well, how to love others well, and what it really means, and what part it can play in a life which is good to live. So once again, getting over those misconceptions, getting over the idea that love is all about romance, is all about that trick that nature plays on us to, what Benedict says in Much Ado, the world must be peopled, and nature's not going to leave it up to us to decide whether that's going to happen or not, hence infatuation and frenzy and erotomania and so on. But the real story about love is something much longer, richer, deeper than that. Just as the real story about death is that death is grief for others and the focal point of lives that we need to live well, so that the fact of our deaths is not the important thing, but the shaping thing. And so one could go on. So in the book, I delve into these questions a little. And they're important to delve into because think of this. Look at what the Stoics say. The Stoics say something which, when you encapsulate it, is really rather beautiful and powerful. They say, we, using that pronoun again, we should regard those things over which we have no control, earthquakes and tsunamis and the fact that we're going to age and die. We should regard those things with courage. But the things that we can control our own appetites and fears and desires, things that we can manage, we should try to achieve some degree of self-mastery. Because if we can look at what's outside us with courage and what's within us with some sense of self-discipline, then we can live nobly. Now, this is a wonderful teaching. But when you explore further into Stoicism, you see they predicate what they say on a very particular view about those things that are outside us. For example, other people and circumstances in society, on which they say we mustn't place too much dependence because we can't control what happens to them. They came up with the idea that we should be indifferent to things that we cannot control. We should exercise what in Greek was called apatheia. Now, of course, we use the word apathy in a quite different way these days, but apatheia means we're not going to be moved by or troubled or disturbed or diverted from our course in life by things that we cannot control. And therefore, when people die or when we, lovers part or when we lose our wealth or our position, our status in society, we mustn't be troubled by that. We must be stoical about it. This underlies the joke I always tell my students in the first lecture of a philosophy course. I say to them, tell them about two old ladies overheard discussing things on a Glasgow bus, one saying to the other, my dear, you mustn't give this, you've got to be philosophical about this. Don't give it another thought. Well, this is exactly the Stoic idea that you must be apathetic towards them. But then there are those who think that to live, with real passion and real engagement, with commitment and accepting the risks, because after all, everything that we do in life carries a risk. To fall in love with somebody who loves you back is immediately to have entered a contract with that person for sorrow. Because one of you is going to die first, or love is going to end, or one of you is going to be unfaithful and leave, or the relationship will end. That's inevitable. Somebody once pointed out that if the divorce rate is 50% in an advanced economy, that means that the other 50% of marriages end in death. So, that's a pretty uncompromising kind of view of things. But that's not a reason for not doing it. The fact that there is a risk that you do enter that contract for sorrow is not a reason for not loving. On the contrary, you have to accept that. You have to be not apathetic, but pathetic. That is, to accept the passion, to accept the trouble that might come with it as a cost really well worth paying for all the good that the situation that you thus create will bring. So there are aspects of the Stoic philosophy that you think that you would do well to think of as being very valuable, and others that one should reflect on, like the Epicurean philosophy. So the Epicurean philosophy is pursue pleasure and avoid pain. That's how you live a life which feels good to live. Now, of course, modern Epicureans are those who drink a lot and party a lot and eat a lot and so forth. But the original Epicureans thought that if you did that, you were just planting the seeds of pain and discomfort. So in order to avoid pain and discomfort, you should live very moderately. Their idea of a good time was to sit under an olive tree and discuss philosophy and have a sip of water and a loaf of bread to share. So what they meant by pleasure and pain is really rather different from the way we see those things now. Pleasure now is partying, pain is having to get up on Monday morning and go to work. But the Epicureans of antiquity didn't think in that way. But what you notice about the Epicurean ideal is that it is something of a withdrawal from life. It's a stepping back. The Epicurean ideal is to occupy a garden. The garden of Epicurus was a place where people decided that they're not going to pursue wealth and pleasure and fame, and not going to strive, because most striving ultimately ends in disappointment. So don't do that. Withdraw to your garden, and then you will have what the ancients most valued. That was what they called ataraxia, which means peace of mind, tranquility. And that the life worth living was the life of tranquility. But that, of course, is a very different conception from, let us say, the existentialists of the 20th century, people like Sartre, Camus, who said that what we have to do in order to make life really worth living is to create meaning in our lives, is to do something and achieve something. A much more vigorous and energetic view of what creates the good. And so there are different ways of thinking about how each of us in our individual lives might seek a life worth living, or a life worth living because it is meaningful, even if it's painful to live. I remember the great artists struggled in order to produce something that they thought had real meaning, even though it didn't make life feel pleasurable in the process of doing it. But this is something each individual has to think about and make choices about. So this business of philosophical reflection on life worth living, on meaningful lives, is something that has a very delicious complexity to it. It invites us into it, to think about it. As I said earlier on, Aristotle, in his great work, The Nicomachean Ethics, said something really very valuable. And that is, at the minute one begins this process, even at the very first moment of embarking on this process of thinking about one's own life, about its values, about what you would like it to be, about what would make it worthwhile for you, what would generate meaning. The minute that you begin to do that, you are already living the life worth living, because it is your own, because you are thinking about it. It is the considered life, the life that Socrates had enjoyed. Thank you very much, buddy.
Anthony, that was great. Thank you very much. I think when I last counted, you covered about 2,500 years of philosophy, what it means to lead a good life. So that's no mean achievement in less than an hour. So well done indeed. Obviously, this will raise lots of questions that people will have. There will be questions online, but also in the room. So we've got plenty of time for questions. Who would like to go first? This lady in the back. If you could speak directly.
Questions, comments, or complaints, or
thinking about challenges and choices, I was particularly taken by one of your phrases, your questions in the book, saying, would you rather be a happy pig or an unhappy Socrates? And I wondered if you ever started off as a happy pig, or have you always been an unhappy Socrates?
I think we all begin as happy pigs when we're little babies, if we're fortunate enough anyway to be cared for by those around us, the adults around us. I often mention to people that the great thing about bringing up children is, given that they are little anarchists, and we have to try to dissuade them from expressing their selfish, egoistical needs and desires too stridently, and to encourage them to develop consideration for others and a way of moderating their behavior so they fit in with others. And that, of course, requires of them self-discipline and restraint. And there lies the sources of, frustration and unhappiness, maybe, that we all feel at times, because we chafe against the fact that we are surrounded by others in society, and they have claims and needs that we have to respect. So from that point of view, the idea of being just completely, a happy pig is one that could only be achieved if we put enough Prozac in the public water supply, and then everybody is a happy pig and they don't bother about anything. Even indeed about the fact that society would run down and collapse, but we wouldn't care because we would just, we'd be happy. Either that or, marijuana on the NHS, something like that would keep us all pleased. But the real point behind your question, and the thing that I discuss in the book, is that happiness is not the point. To pursue happiness almost guarantees that you will be unhappy. What you have to be doing is doing something that you really do regard as worth doing, even if it's difficult, even if it takes time, even if you have to be patient, even if you have to learn the skills, the things required to bring that about or achieve it. And then happiness will creep up on you from behind. You may not even notice it at the time that it arrives, but when you reflect on it afterwards, you'll see it. I liken happiness to that little chink of light at the edge of the curtain in a very dark room, which you can't see if you look at it directly, but which you notice in the corner of your eye when you look at something else. That's what happiness is. But the real point, the essential point there is that to pursue happiness, to think that this or that or the other will make you happy, that is a kind of chimera. And we all know that when you really want something and then you achieve it, how long does the satisfaction last? Until something else, another goal, another summit beckons to us and we want to do something else. If you will think, oh God, how marvelous it would be just to live on a beach somewhere with palm trees and sunshine and a gentle breeze, never having to do anything other than drink your daiquiri, whatever it is you do. How long would that last? How many weeks or months or years could you endure that kind of existence?
Okay, more questions in the room? Right at the back, there's a lady in the middle, and I come to the gentleman at the back next. Yes. Speak directly.
Hello. I don't know if this question is going to make sense, but I'll try. Is there an argument for adapting your philosophy to the situation? So is there a time for sort of stoicism, or is it more a case of moulding your philosophy to what life throws at you, or like adapting your philosophy as you go along?
One very